Hello! Notice the title of this video? Think it sounds a little bit over the top because I agree with you. I actually thought it was over the top the first time I saw it when Arielle did it here. So if you want to change your title, Arielle, go ahead and I'll change mine. But I think this one is just a little bit more accurate than yours. Now I don't expect you to respond to this, Arielle. I know you didn't talk to Vosh because your rhetoric just can't hold up to any scrutiny whatsoever. I know you said it's because he used a very particular word, but you and I both know that you're perfectly fine using that word in private to people that you don't like. But on the slim chance that you do respond to this video, please do me a favor and don't cut around all the points I made. I know you love doing that. You did it to Noah, you did it to Calvin. Please don't do it to this, because you're just wasting everyone's time, aren't you? Speaking of, if you want to go and watch Arielle's video to make sure that I'm not cutting around her and making her look bad, feel free. I don't think she's getting any ad money anyway. So do what you want. You'll probably see most of Arielle's video in this video because I don't need to obfuscate her points to make them seem misguided and silly. I just want to point out that there's actually no black person in your video, Arielle. I'm sure you knew that. You know, usually when you do a video like this, you'll get a person from the group that you're bashing to come on and read your script. Well, either you'll get them to read your script or you'll just cut around them disagreeing with you. If you want an insight into how Arielle sets up her videos with trans people, I've got links in the description to videos that you should watch on that subject. Okay, all of that's out of the way. Let's just get into the video right now.
And just to be clear, Black Lives Matter is not a nonprofit or registered 501c3 organization. It is a corporation.
The phrase Black Lives Matter can refer to a Twitter hashtag, a slogan, a social movement, or a loose confederation of groups advocating for racial justice. As a movement, Black Lives Matter is decentralized. Even the leaders have said that you should promote local organization over sort of national overall leadership. So Black Lives Matter is decentralized. That means there's chapters both in and out of America that don't operate with, you know, your sort of traditional hierarchy. They basically just need to sort of adhere to guiding principles that are set out by the Black Lives Matter movement, and other than that, they're not really organized or controlled by one singular group. Now, there are benefits to that, but one of the big drawbacks is that one person can make a statement and it can be attributed to Black Lives Matter as a whole when they really only represent either themselves or just a chapter. All my sources are in the description. You can find an LA Times article from Matt Pierce where he says, the words could be serving as a political rallying cry or referring to the activist organization, or it can be a fuzzily applied label used to describe a wide range of protests and conversations focused on racial inequality. So the whole point of what I'm saying here is that Black Lives Matter can mean a lot of things. So when you're talking about Black Lives Matter, it's really helpful to make sure that you know which one you're talking about. Through most of Arielle's video, it seems like she's talking about the Black Lives Matter Foundation, but then she starts to attribute things that aren't really to do with the foundation exactly to the foundation, which I think is kind of unfair. You are right though, the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation is actually not a registered 501c3. Scandalous, I know. So I took to Google to find out what was going on here. So when you Google this, Black Lives Matter 501c3, what you actually find is a lot of articles debunking a tweet from, surprise, surprise, Candace Owens. If you don't know who Candace Owens is, she's actually the person that Gina, the person in Arielle's video, works for. So I wonder where Gina got this one from. Okay, that might be a spurious connection at best, but in my defense, it's hard to know where any of the information that these guys talk about actually comes from because Arielle doesn't cite her sources. Literally, not a single thing she says in this video is cited anywhere. Got no idea where it's coming from. But to the actual point, you know, you're actually right. Black Lives Matter, the foundation, is not a registered 501c3. That's a really bad thing, right? It's not. It's not a bad thing at all. So Black Lives Matter is a non-profit which operates with a fiscal sponsorship agreement with 1,000 currents. So it's not actually uncommon for non-profit organizations to incorporate, as in become corporations, in order to get tax benefits and legal protection. It's also not uncommon for non-profits to enter fiscal sponsorship agreements when they're not yet tax exempt under the IRS. So when you give money to Black Lives Matter, you're actually giving money to 1,000 currents, which is a registered 501c3. And then 1,000 currents kind of grants that money to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter entered this agreement in 2016, and what it means is that 1,000 currents basically runs the legal and admin stuff, and Black Lives Matter, the foundation, can focus more on their programs. And all the money that goes to 1,000 currents for Black Lives Matter does end up with Black Lives Matter. So there's not really a hidden thing here, it's just a common way that non-profits operate. So while what you've said is technically correct, Black Lives Matter, the foundation, is not a registered 501c3, that is misleading. There are non-profit organizations and there are non-profit corporations. Being a corporation doesn't mean that you can't be non-profit. So being a registered 501c3 is not the only way to be a non-profit, and also not being that doesn't mean that you're automatically not a non-profit at all. Do you know what a 501c3 actually means? And this is from the IRS. A 501c3 organization is a corporation, trust, unincorporated association, or other type of organization exempt from federal income tax under section 501c3 of Title 26 of the United States Code. Saying Black Lives Matter isn't a non-profit or 501c3 organization, it's a corporation, is very compelling, and it seems to align with the facts, but it also omits the remainder of the truth. This point is nothing. It doesn't mean anything. What you're saying sounds great, and to be honest, when I heard it, I was like, oh my god, Black Lives Matter is really awful. But as soon as you look into it, you realize that this is just fluff to make Black Lives Matter sound bad. The way that Black Lives Matter operates is the way that a number of non-profits operate. Saying that it not being a registered 501c3 means that it's not a non-profit is just not true.
Obviously, it's not my place to talk about Black Lives Matter specifically.
But you're gonna do it anyway. Now, Gina, I'm pretty sure, is not black, and Arielle, you're not black either. And it seems really weird for the two of you to sit here and tell black people what's good for them, especially Arielle, when you couldn't get one on to come and read your script. Okay, maybe that was a cheap shot. I don't know that you actually script all of your videos with other people, but Storm Ryan has confirmed that you script pretty much all of your videos with other trans people on them. So I wouldn't be surprised if you were going to do the same thing with this video. The point here isn't that you can only talk about black issues and Black Lives Matter with black people present, not at all. My point is more the fact that you don't really seem to feature that many black people in your content. And in this video, where it would be very pertinent to include a black person and their opinions and thoughts and feelings on this, you still chose not to. I've actually taken quite a while to get this video out, and in the time since writing and recording this, you have uploaded a video with black people in it. Although, it's one of you watching them kiss, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. If they're consenting, they can do whatever they want. They can make their own decisions. What I'm questioning here is your decision not to include a black person in your video about Black Lives Matter, but to make a video where you are a voyeur for black people. It's almost as though you're fine sexualizing black people, but not listening to their opinions on issues that actually affect them. I'm not trying to say that's actually what you think, Arielle. I'm just saying think about how it looks. It's kind of weird to not include black people in a video where it's probably quite important to include black people, but to include them when you want to watch them have sex.
Like, the juxtaposition between Black Lives Matter and like the trans rights activists are so similar to me.
There's no juxtaposition here. They're both similar movements looking for equality.
If you're not with us, you're against us, or if you think differently, you're against us.
So this is something I've seen thrown around a lot, and I think it's being misrepresented here. Arielle's different thoughts are fundamental disagreements on whether trans people should effectively be treated as second-class citizens, or whether black Americans actually face a problem of police brutality. This is not just thinking a little differently. You can't be an LGBT activist if you don't support the rights of all LGBT people, and you can't support the Black Lives Matter movement if you don't actually think that police brutality is an actual problem that black people face, and that systemic racism is real. Don't be fooled into thinking that these are groups that don't allow any diversity of thought. There are things that I disagree with a lot of people in the Black Lives Matter movement about, but we are united under the belief that systemic racism needs to be dismantled, that systemic racism is real, and the fact that a facet of that systemic racism is police brutality to black people. Equally, there are things I disagree with others on in regards to the LGBT plus community, but we are united under the belief that all LGBT plus people deserve to be treated equally and fairly, live safely and comfortably, and not be treated with any prejudice in regards to their sex, sexuality, or gender. Arielle seems to disagree with a few fundamental things there, which is why she's not accepted in those groups. It's not just because she thinks a little differently, it's because the thoughts that she does have are actively in opposition to the core tenets of those movements. It would be pretty hard for me to exist as a feminist or a feminist ally if I didn't believe that women under the age of 30 should be allowed to vote. If you have thoughts and beliefs that are diametrically opposed to the values of a movement, you can't expect to be accepted within that movement.
You run an organization that is literally the opposite of Black Lives Matter.
Blexit, it speaks to a black exit from the left.
Right.
And we're very specific. We say the left because it's not so much of liberal or the Democratic Party.
This one is actually quite interesting to me. I've seen Arielle talk about her exit from the left and her move towards the right before, but my issue with it is that the left and right aren't political parties. They're not groups in the strictest sense. Left and right are just general categorizations for the political views and ideals that a person holds. But what you're doing here is representing left and right as distinct groups. Now, this is a really smart thing to do if you want to radicalize people, because you're not asking them to change their values, you're just asking them to move from one group to another group. You're moving away from the crazy illogical left into the cool and rational right. Obviously, you can't exit the left without changing your ideals. What I'm saying is that the left is a pretty sweeping phrase that can encompass anyone that is remotely left-leaning, and that's a pretty big group you end up with. And also, saying left and right removes you from any of the actual policies associated with the political parties that fall under those alignments. Now, if you're moving from the left to the right, you'd assume that you'd probably want to start voting for more right-wing politicians. In the UK, that means voting for Tories, and in the US, that means voting for Republicans. But you could say that many people in those parties are against rights for all LGBT people, at least more so than Labour in the UK or Democrats in the US. So what you're doing is moving from a political party that on average is more in support of LGBT plus rights to a political party party that is, on average, less in support of LGBT plus rights. But if you say you're leaving the left and moving to the right and just completely remove the political parties, you're opening yourself up to less scrutiny because it's so vague. This is kind of brilliant and also terrible because it almost completely changes the scenario. So you're not shifting your ideals to align more with those that actively operate against the best interests of the protected groups that you fall under. What it looks like you're doing now is just making a change from a less rational group to a more rational group. Interestingly though, Candace Owens, one of the heads of Blexit, has actually disagreed with Gina on this one. She specifically said that it was an exit from the Democratic Party. Blexit is a renaissance. Blexit is the black exit from the Democratic Party. It's the black exit from permanent victimhood, the black exit from the false idea that we are somehow separate from the rest of America. Now, in all fairness, that quote is from November 2018. If you look to November 2019, last year, you'll see that she actually says it's an exit from the left. It's an exit from political orthodoxy and from the left, which bases your worth on your skin color, sex, and sexual orientation. The black exit from liberal agenda is really what Blexit is. I've also got another quote in regards to Donald Trump. I tell them I support the president, but I'm not telling you to vote for him. Just to vote for your values. It's not a call to leave the left and run to the right. It's a call to people to think independently. Now this is a bit muddied here because some of our supporters definitely think it's an exit from the Democratic Party.
It's time for, black people to leave the Democratic Party, leave the plantation.
We're working to get blacks to quit the Democratic Party. We need to leave.
Candace Owens supports Trump, but in all fairness, she doesn't explicitly say to go out and vote for him. Although if you're advocating for leaving the left, you're advocating for a move towards either center or right. Now, America is basically a two-party system, so if you're doing that, leaving the left, the Democrats, you're basically pushing people towards the Republicans, which is Trump. The support for Trump and the push to lead the left is kind of enough without ever having to explicitly say, go and vote for Trump.
But it's just this mob mentality and the craziness and the illogical thinking of the left.
See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Who are the left in this situation? One would assume that the left just describes all people that hold kind of left-wing values, but by turning it into a group, you can discredit those values by assigning them to mob mentality and craziness. Realistically, the left is too large of a group to accurately attribute these descriptions to. But what you can do is take some small fringe groups, say that's the left, and discredit all of those values and ideals based on this small fringe group. Although it's not the exact same situation, you can see a kind of similar thing happening with Muslims and Christians. When a fringe group of Christians or a fringe group of Muslims do something horrible, you can then discredit all of Islam or all of Christianity based on that fringe group. It's not really a good argument at all, and it's just an easy way to get rid of having to deal with the actual ideals that are presented to you. I'm not really sure what the illogical thinking here is, but if it's the values of the left, you should really specify that it's left-wing values that you oppose. And here's the thing, if it's not the values that you oppose, then an exit from the left just doesn't make sense. Surely you'd retain those values and just make a left-wing group that has more logical ways of expressing them. I could very easily pick out some fringe right-wing groups and discredit them as being crazy, bigoted, or violent, but it makes so much more sense just to deconstruct the actual values. There are irrational and logical groups on both sides. What separates the left from the right is a difference in core values and beliefs.
Chapters are always on the ground, actually helping Black America thrive. We did a conflict resolution program in North Carolina with some kids who have been in and out of juvie and struggling with behavioral issues. So we're always helping families thrive in Black communities. And so that's why we are the exact opposite of Black Lives Matter.
So what Gina's doing here is presenting a false dichotomy. She's basically saying it's either Black Lives Matter or Blexit. And that's not really the case. If Blexit is about the on-the-ground improvement of living conditions and education in specific Black communities, then it can absolutely coexist with Black Lives Matter. Look, here is what Black Lives Matter says their goal is on their website, is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. Both of those goals can absolutely coexist. Furthermore, I could comment on a portion of the funds for Blexit being spent on their fifth pillar, which is presenting the message of Blexit through provocative visual art and compelling live experiences. What exactly is that doing for Black families, other than furthering your message of leaving the left and giving Candace Owens a stage to talk to her fans? See, this is where you could say that Black Lives Matter and Blexit are opposites and actually be more accurate. This doesn't even get to one of my biggest issues with this, the fact that Black Lives Matter is not just an American non-profit. As I've said, it's a global, decentralized movement against white supremacy. So comparing it to Blexit just doesn't really make much sense. Yes, there's a non-profit operating under the name Black Lives Matter, but when people say Black Lives Matter, they're not only talking about the non-profit, they're not even necessarily talking about the non-profit at all. Granted, this could be the case with Blexit, but that really seems to be US based, so it'd be on a much, much smaller scale. And on top of that, Black Lives Matter isn't even a fundamentally left-wing ideal, unless you think that police brutality resulting from systemic racism is a solely left-wing idea.
You don't know how many trainers I know, and how many makeup artists, and how many fashion designers are suddenly activists and advocates for Black America out of nowhere.
Aren't you a trainer? And didn't your boss work at Vogue? You're not doing a very good job to discredit people if this is the way that you're trying to do it. It seems like you're trying to hit on performative activism, but can I remind you that you can be both a trainer and an activist? You seem to be perfectly capable of that, so I'm sure other people are too.
Are suddenly?
Suddenly. If they're white, they've probably been able to ignore this for the majority of their life. It makes sense that people would suddenly pick it up now that it's a massive thing, because they weren't aware of it before. But now that they are aware of it, they want to get on board and try to make a difference. I don't see how that makes their support any less valid. Now, if you're talking about performative activism, then, you know what, yeah, I would agree with you, but it's difficult to see what you actually mean, because it sounds like you're disparaging these people's support for the issue based on their profession, or the fact that they hadn't heard about all of these problems up until recently.
And do you know how many of these trainers and people I follow on Instagram, I'm friends with online, do you know how many times I have shared links to donate to Blexit, to help Blexit, and not a single one of them has ever expressed interest in helping Black America? Because it wasn't trendy, it wasn't popular, and now I have people who have the audacity to come at me for not posting a black box.
I wonder why people might be more hesitant to donate to an organization that, while it does help Black communities, also advocates for an exit from the left. Here's the thing. Ending white supremacy, ending police brutality, and generally making efforts to improve the lives of Black people, those are broad topics that most of us can kind of get behind if we want to improve the lives of Black people. Leaving the left is inherently more political, which means it's obviously going to be more divisive, which obviously means that if you're left-wing or even left-leaning, you're probably not going to want to give your money to that. And if you look into it and see that the head of Blexit supports Donald Trump, and you don't support Donald Trump, you're probably not going to want to give your money to that organization. Although it seems that the people at Blexit have kind of caught on to this, because you'll notice that they don't explicitly say that it's an exit from the Democratic Party anymore, and if you look on their website, they don't really mention anywhere that it's an exit from the left, despite the fact that the name is still Blexit. And actually, when you go to their website, you'll also notice that they don't really talk very much about all the programs that they do. They talk more about the event that they're putting on. Now, I'm not saying that they haven't set up those programs. I'm certain that they absolutely have. What I am saying is that from the way they present themselves on their website, they seem less like a charitable organization dedicated to improving the lives of Black people, and much more like a mouthpiece for the views of Candace Owens. Seems really uncomfortable that they actually spend money on getting Candace Owens on stage in front of her fans. And I'm not the only one to call them her fans, by the way. Remember that clip that I showed you earlier? Here's another part of it.
We caught up with Candace Owens just before a recent crowd-pleasing appearance in the heart of Baltimore, where her fans lined up outside.
Again, I'm sure that Blexit do good work for Black communities. I'm not denying or disparaging that. It's the events and the exit from the left that's tacked onto that I have an issue with, and I'm sure a lot of other people have a big problem with that too. I'm sure a lot of people are overlooking Blexit while supporting Black Lives Matter, and it's not necessarily because they're performative activists, although I'm sure some are. It's because Blexit is directly against left-wing values. So anyone that's remotely left-wing wouldn't want to support Blexit. Millions have been raised for Black Lives Matter and for bail funds. Blexit not getting that same treatment is probably more to do with the way that it presents itself and its ideals, rather than people not wanting to support something because it's not trendy. I sincerely doubt that a significant portion of people donated to bail funds because they were trendy. People donate to bail funds because they're a material way to help people in the situation right now without any other clear agenda. People didn't support Black Lives Matter and not Blexit just because Black Lives Matter is more trendy. Blexit is a much harder sell if you're even remotely left-wing. It's literally called Blexit, and Candace Owens supports Trump. Why would you want to help that if you're remotely left-wing? Look, if Blexit only put its money towards aiding Black communities, then you'd have an argument. But it doesn't, so you don't. On top of that, the Black Square thing for Blackout Tuesday wasn't even started by Black Lives Matter. In fact, a lot of Black Lives Matter activists came out and said that it was performative and unhelpful. It wasn't a Black Lives Matter initiative, so I'm not even sure what your point here is supposed to be. Blackout Tuesday was performative. We can both agree on that. It doesn't support your point any more than it supports me. So trying to pin that on Black Lives Matter or say that that's a kind of Black Lives Matter thing is just disingenuous.
Funny thing is that everyone across the political spectrum has agreed a long time ago that George Floyd's death, his murder, was unjust.
Yes, but appropriate action was only taken after global protests. And what about Breonna Taylor? And what about Belly Mujinga? There are still black people out there that are facing the same problem of not getting justice for the crimes that were committed against them. This isn't just a single issue. This is an issue that happens to multiple black people. The fact that you're saying, oh, we all agreed it was bad a little while ago is incredibly reductive. We can only agree that it was bad after global protest. How do you not get that? Anyway, here we go. Let's listen to you try to deny that systemic racism exists, or at least that it doesn't contribute to police brutality towards black people.
In 2019, of course, which is the latest data that we have, 9 black people were killed by cops, unarmed by cops, right? And if you compare that to 19 white people who have been killed by cops, right?
Damn, you got me. Although you haven't cited your sources, so I've got no idea where you're getting this info from, but I will just take you on your word for it. And you know what? You're absolutely right. When we look at the raw data, there's about double the number of unarmed white people being killed by cops in America in comparison to the number of unarmed black people being killed by cops in America. And I'm sure that when we adjust for the population sizes, that's absolutely going to stay the same. Oh wait, no, hold on. There's about 13% people in the US that are black and about 76% that are white. That means that when you adjust for those population sizes, it's not remotely the same. For this to be remotely equal, you'd expect to see the number of white people being killed to be about 6 times that of the number of black people. Using the numbers that you have given, black people are being killed at a rate of about 2.8 times higher than that of white people. Because you haven't cited your sources, it's hard to know the scope of this data. Usually when we see unarmed killings by police, that usually means shootings. Now, George Floyd wasn't killed by a gun, he was killed by a knee on his neck. So realistically, the numbers that you've quoted there might not even be fully accurate to the number of people being killed by police in America. It might only represent the number of people being shot dead by police in America. That's not even to mention the fact that it's not unheard of for the police to plant evidence and fudge the numbers. I'm not saying to throw all this data out because it doesn't disagree with me. Remember, these numbers actually do agree with my point. All I'm saying is that they might not be as accurate as they could be.
It's not about the killing, it's about a systemic thing. And it's like, okay, like, let's talk about that.
Arielle, where have you been? We have been talking about that. We've been demonstrating it exists. In fact, you have literally demonstrated it with the data that you presented.
And just to be clear, Black Lives Matter is not a nonprofit or registered 501c3 organization. It is a corporation.
I've already spoke about this bit, but I do love that you put it at the start. It's a lovely little bit of misinformation, completely devoid of context, so that your audience can take it away and spout it as a fact without understanding what it means or why it's not actually all that relevant.
A lot of people come after Blexit and they accuse Candace or they accuse Blexit.
Going to Trump and you're supporting Trump, and it's like literally... No,
we legally literally can't do that.
Legally, as a not-for-profit, the money has to go back into the organization.
It's funny. It's genuinely funny to me when people are like, well, what about Blexit? I'm like, we are a registered 501c3 organization. You can see where every single dollar goes. Like, it is completely transparent.
Yes, legally, all the money has to go back into Blexit, but Blexit also pays for Candace Owens to put on these events. Now, I'm not saying that Candace Owens uses those events to support Trump. The fact that Candace Owens is kind of the face of Blexit, a charity whose goal is to start a black exit from the left on top of helping black communities, the fact that she supports Trump is relevant. When you want people to exit the left in basically a two-party system and the face of your charity is a Trump supporter, that is relevant. While you're not directly using your funds to support the Trump campaign, you can't deny that there is some support for the Trump campaign in there. Granted, people that say that Blexit funds Trump are wrong. That would be illegal. But you can't deny that Candace Owens' very, very vocal political views don't have some impact on the people that support Blexit, especially when Candace Owens puts on a number of events in the name of Blexit. Again, I'm not saying that Candace Owens uses those events to garner support for Trump. What I am saying that it's hard to extricate her views from an exit from the left.
We have no ties to any political party, to any political candidate. We are actually on the ground helping Black Americans do better in school, mend their family life, get a better job, and this is what we do, and yet...
But it's not woke.
But it's not woke.
But apparently it's not woke.
Yeah, it's not woke. It's not trendy.
You don't have any financial ties, no, but Candace Owens, who is prominently displayed on the website and regularly gives speeches at charity events, has pretty strong ties to Trump. Ignoring that connection just because there's no paper trail of money is ridiculous. Blexit doesn't exist in a vacuum. Boiling the qualms that people have with Blexit down to it's not woke is just reductive. You can have all of these programs that directly help black communities, but you also advocate for an exit from the left, and indirectly a move towards the right or towards Trump. I say indirectly because you don't explicitly state it as a goal, but that's kind of the only outcome, and it would be silly to disregard it as irrelevant. It's not like you're an organization that only supports black communities. There are obviously other agendas that clearly conflict with people's views.
That a lot of people who are coming out in support of Black Lives Matter, I think they have a good heart.
They mean well.
They mean well. Black Lives Matter is the very last thing that is actually going to help Black America get better, and is actually going to help Black America move from where they've been for the last few decades and move forward and thrive.
I guess all black people in support of Black Lives Matter just don't know what's good for them then. It comes off as being very uncomfortable that you've got someone on your channel telling black people that they don't actually face the problems that they say they face, and also that the solutions they come up to those problems are not the right solutions. Especially when that's someone that doesn't think that systemic racism doesn't exist in the form of violence just because they've not seen it. And that's not even to mention that Black Lives Matter is not only American.
Hey, there are way bigger major issues of facing Black America today.
Yes, there are lots of issues facing black Americans, but Black Lives Matter specifically targets white supremacy and police violence. There are other issues it can be said about any movement that doesn't address every single problem. Police violence and discrimination against black people is a big problem facing black people today. In fact, it's a problem that we have decided is worthy of dismantling. We're not saying that Black Lives Matter is going to cure racism or solve every problem facing black people. Again, Black Lives Matter was set up by and is supported by black people. It doesn't come off too well with you guys sitting there telling us that you know what's best. Especially you, Arielle, you clearly have no idea what you are talking about.
Fatherless homes. We need criminal justice reform.
Cite your sources. Where is this coming from? How is anyone supposed to agree or disagree or fact check what you're saying if you don't give them any idea of where it's coming from? Hold on, just give me a second. Right, okay, I think I figured out where this has come from, but I want to make a little aside here. Arielle seems to have taken her screenshots from this 3-year-old article by someone called Fisher Jack. Now bear in mind, this Fisher Jack pumps out multiple articles every single day for months on end. So either they're hopped up on caffeine or they're an AI journalist. Either way, I don't know if we can take the opinions of this person on what problems black people are facing very seriously. Given this article is written by someone who usually covers entertainment news, I question why Arielle chose this article in particular to quote from. Especially given that even this article doesn't cite its sources. Although it's probably because other than this article and PragerU, you won't find many sources espousing the idea that not getting married is a bigger problem for black people than racism. Anyway, back to the actual content of the article. Again, none of these studies are named or cited, so it's very difficult to find out where it actually comes from, although some of this data does align with things that I found elsewhere. Also, it's kind of hilarious that this article is referencing an 18-year-old study. That's almost half the time between 1963 and 2002. However, this is where I've got an issue. This article claims that the percentage of illegitimate black children rises from 24% up to 70% due to welfare becoming a right. Where is the evidence for that? Is there no other factor at hand? You've literally chosen 2 data points, said, here's a thing that happened in between, and said, that is the only reason for it. Are you kidding me? What this article is doing is taking 2 data points and saying that this one factor caused the change between those data points. That's not how you work with data. There are a number of factors that could have affected that change between 1963 and 2002. You're ignoring every other factor because this one proves your point for you. That's not how it works. Interestingly though, the rates for illegitimate children has risen for every single group since the 1960s, not just for black people. Coincidentally, the marriage rate has also been decreasing. Given the fact that an illegitimate child is one born out of wedlock, i.e. one with unmarried parents, it makes sense that the number of children born illegitimate will go up as the marriage rates go down. So the number of unmarried black women has gone up, but also the birth rate for black women has gone down. So more black women are not getting married, and a lot of those women are also not having kids. But also, the number of married black women that are having kids is also gone down. Remember how I said that an illegitimate child is one born to unmarried parents? See, that doesn't necessitate that an illegitimate child lives in a single parent household. You can absolutely be an illegitimate child and have a mum and a dad that you live with. They're just not married. Again, this article has taken 2 data points and used them without any thought of the broader context. Here's my favorite line from this section. Too many African-American families grow up without a father figure in the house, which often leads to psychological issues later in life. It's absolutely hilarious that a lesbian would use this in her video. Growing up without a father figure can lead to psychological issues. So either lesbians can't have kids because they'll have psychological issues because they don't have a father figure, or one of the mothers will have to adopt a father figure role, or they'll have to bring in an outside father figure just to make sure the kid doesn't get messed up. Look, I know I'm being hyperbolic and a little bit silly, but come on, Arielle, you've got to see the irony in posting that. Just to clarify, so no one takes this out of context, I'm not saying that lesbians can't or shouldn't have kids. I think that anyone that can provide a loving home should have a kid, or could have a kid. There you go. In all seriousness, I have found sources that do point to higher rates of mental illness in kids in single-parent households. Not single-mother households, single-parent households. So it's not necessarily all rubbish. But saying it's down to the lack of a father figure is unsubstantiated. I can't really find any evidence to support that. Although you'll also see higher rates of mental illness in those living with unmarried parents and also those living with step-siblings. Step-siblings kind of point to a two-parent household, so maybe it's not the lack of a father figure that causes the mental illness. Maybe this problem is more multifaceted and can't be written off as solely due to the lack of a daddy. Additionally, single-parent households can be caused by either the death or incarceration of a parent, both things that are pretty traumatic to go through and you'd expect to see result in mental health issues, and also the latter of which is heavily influenced by systemic racism. I'm not saying that every single problem that black people face is caused by systemic racism, but the nature of systemic racism is such that it influences a lot of things because it systematically influences black people's lives.
And let's talk about the abortion rates.
Yeah, let's talk about the abortion rates.
I mean, everyone has different opinions about abortion, but you can't deny the statistics that black women are aborting their children more than any other racial group. The disproportionate rates are just insane. And one of the biggest reasons is because Planned Parenthood, they drop a location in every single poor black neighborhood that they can. Between 2012...
Wow, because they're making money off.
This article that you've got here makes some pretty big claims. This heightened loss of uncounted lives percolates to reduced respect for life and has played its role in decreasing civility with which people treat each other. This feels fairly anti-abortion. Don't worry, Arielle, I had a look at your Twitter while I was researching for this video, so I know you're pro-choice, but still, I questioned the use of this in the video. Although let's look at what you tweeted. So you said it's not about the abortion itself, but it's about why the abortion rates are so high. Now, I believe that's what you believe, but I don't think that's what's going through Gina's head. Gina seems to be very anti-abortion. That's really colouring her view on this topic. In fact, it doesn't seem that Gina's against this because of why the abortions are happening, so much as the fact that the abortions are happening in the first place. But let's put that on the back burner for right now and get into your issue with the why of the abortion rates. So why are these abortion rates so high? I'm sure you know that abortion rates aren't just higher in the black population, but they're actually higher in lower income population. African Americans have a higher rate of poverty in the US, so it makes sense that they'd be overrepresented when it comes to things that correlate with poverty or low income families. But that doesn't really answer why abortion rates are higher among lower income individuals. That's a pretty easy one. It's generally attributed to a lack of access to education, a lack of access to contraception, and less financial stability to support a child. This isn't some insidious measure by Planned Parenthood to force black people into having abortions. And saying that Planned Parenthood are to blame for increased abortion rates is ridiculous. You're already painting abortion as a bad thing here. What Planned Parenthood actually do is provide safe abortions and support for those that need or want them. Decreasing black people's access to safe abortions isn't actually addressing the reason for those high abortion rates in the first place. And in fact, all you're really going to do is increase the rates of unsafe abortions.
Well, because they're making money off
Because
it.
they're making money.
If these Planned Parenthoods weren't there, we'd be restricting access to safe abortions. And what we'd likely see is an increase in unsafe abortions or kids born to unmarried or unwilling parents, or increases in all of these things. This point just doesn't make sense unless you concede that systemic racism is the cause for those higher abortion rates. Either that, or you think that black people are being coerced into having abortions when they don't need or want them. But this is the thing. If someone needs or wants an abortion, they should be able to get one. Putting those Planned Parenthoods in black neighborhoods is not exploitation of black people, it's providing them a medical service that they need. Some people might disagree on whether abortions are good or bad. Gina clearly thinks that they're not a good thing. But Arielle, you say that you're not anti-abortion. So then why are you against this if the reason is obviously systemic racism and not black people being exploited by Planned Parenthood? The reason I'm skipping over the debate of whether abortion is good or bad is because Arielle herself has said that she's not anti-abortion, so realistically these points should hold up whether you think abortion is good or bad. But as you'll probably see, the way these points are being made, they only really stand up if you believe that abortion is bad, inherently bad. Otherwise, they're not really strong points at all. Placing Planned Parenthoods in black neighborhoods isn't exploitative, it's providing a medical service. It's no more exploitative than building a hospital, since Americans have got to pay for that as well. If it was a hospital or another business that provides a medical service, you wouldn't be saying it's exploitative. So why are Planned Parenthoods exploitative? Is it because they provide abortions? Because they also do other things beyond abortions. But clearly the issue here is with abortions, not with why the abortions are happening. If you're blaming it on Planned Parenthood, then it can't really be why the abortions are happening, because that's not really why the abortions are happening. The point here is that the existence of Planned Parenthoods in those neighborhoods is not what is driving the high abortion rates. It's what's allowing the abortion rates to get high, but what is driving it? Something else obviously needs to be driving that, because people don't just see a Planned Parenthood and decide to have an abortion.
2012 to 2016, more black babies were aborted than born in New York. So we've got way bigger issues to tackle if we're talking about Black America thriving and doing better.
Here we go. This is a good one. Now look at the thing that she's got on screen there, right? Why don't we zoom in? Zoom in. Look at that. Okay. Now this does not substantiate the claim that she makes in the video at all. This is just generally talking about high abortion rates among African Americans. Let's check out the article because I've had a bit of a look at it. And to be honest, for someone that's pro-choice, Arielle, you seem to be choosing a lot from articles that are very anti-abortion, which just seems odd. Surely you'd go for something that's maybe a little more neutral on it rather than something that literally says numbers of babies killed. Yeah, and I'm not even joking. The article quite literally goes on to say 124,893 white abortions and 121,829 black abortions that year. A difference of 3,064 babies killed. I don't really think you should be quoting from an article that talks about abortion in such a negative light, because obviously it's going to be biased. Yes, the stats are there, but the reasons behind it are going to be biased. So the higher abortion rate in comparison to birth rate, yeah, that's true. I just think it's really funny that Arielle couldn't actually quote that part of the article in the video. Like, what is going on there, man? But anyway, back to my main point. Arielle, you said that you're pro-choice, and I want to believe you on that, so I question why, for this point, which in and of itself seems quite anti-abortion, you only seem to be pulling from articles that are themselves against abortion. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't pull from a wide array of sources. Obviously, each source will have its own individual bias, but it does seem odd that someone that is supposedly pro-choice is only pulling from articles that are very much antithetical to that to prove this point about abortion. I'm only bringing this up because Arielle herself has said that she's pro-choice, and I don't really understand why you would bring up this point in particular if you are pro-choice. It just doesn't really make sense. Now, I know that you've said, Arielle, that it's the why and not the abortions themselves that are concerning, but the why is quite obviously systemic racism. Again, if you're not anti-abortion, it doesn't make sense to include this point unless you talk about systemic racism. Because this is the thing, Planned Parenthood are not at fault for these high abortion rates. A high number of Planned Parenthoods in those areas are not causing the high rates of abortion. Yes, they are providing the abortions, but they are not providing the reasons for the abortion. It's not like someone walks past a Planned Parenthood and thinks, oh, do you know what? I think I'll treat myself to an abortion today. Yep, that sounds like a good idea. Thank you very much. That's just not how it works at all. And you both know that. I know that you know that. People don't have abortions just because they see Planned Parenthoods or just because Planned Parenthoods exist. People would likely still have abortions if the Planned Parenthood wasn't there. It just wouldn't be safe. Yes, the number of abortions exceeded the number of births. If you're not anti-abortion, that isn't too concerning in and of itself. What is concerning is what that points to. And what that points to is the systemic racism that causes those higher abortion rates. That's the why, Arielle. Systemic racism is the why. The thing that you've been arguing against in your video is the why. Again, the reason you should be concerned is because of how the high abortion rates reflect on the income, education, and access to resources of those groups, not because of the number of babies killed.
We need to put fathers back in the home. We need to give kids a better education. We need to give more economic opportunity to them. We need to do more for these communities.
Yeah, you know what? We can actually agree on that, but I do have one question for you. Where do you think those fathers are? I would argue that a lot of reasons for absentee fathers can find their roots in systemic racism. The school-to-prison pipeline, keeping black people poor and then forcing them into crime, keeping black kids in poor areas, which means they go to underfunded schools. All of these things will contribute to fathers not being there for their kids. I mean, if you're in jail, you can't be there. If you had a kid too young and you can't support it, you're likely not going to be there. All of these issues that systemic racism causes will contribute to fathers not being there for their kids. But you seem to think that because systemic racism doesn't exist, that all of these issues are due to the failings of the black race. That's what it seems like you're saying, guys. If systemic racism isn't to blame for this, then black people are to blame for it. I don't know what you're trying to say other than that. Dangerous cities have high African American populations. Dangerous cities like Oakland, Cleveland, Baltimore, and Detroit, where gang violence and crime is an everyday occurrence, has a high population of African American people who live under the government of Democrats. Okay, this one is great because it says so much with so little backing it up. What does dangerous cities actually mean? How is that quantified? It doesn't say in the article, so I'll have to assume that it probably means higher crime rates. Now, we know that crime rates correlate with poverty and lower income, and we know that black people are more likely to be in poverty or have lower income, and that actually crime rates are higher with black people. We can attribute this to a systemic oppression that makes it harder for black people to escape that cycle. Providing economic opportunities is just one part of it. Obviously, these opportunities may not already be afforded to black people because of institutionalized racism. This article just makes a statement with no numbers, no source, and no evidence. Where are the conclusions being drawn from? Where is the data? Arielle will talk about the numbers just not plain agreeing with the left, but the fact is that a lot of the time she just doesn't use numbers at all, and when she does use numbers, she has to obfuscate and hide what the numbers actually mean. You can't just look at high crime rates, high African American population, and governance by Democrats and decide how those three data points interact and influence one another. Did this article look at the change in crime rates over time when compared to Republicans or Democrats being in office? Did it look at the level at which these Democrats actually govern these cities? Or did it look at the voting intentions of the black individuals in those cities to see whether they voted for the Democrats or not? No, it didn't. It just made a claim without any concrete evidence whatsoever. This is so sneaky, by the way, implying that the Democrats are at fault for these crime rates being so high. There are so many things that can influence high crime rates, and saying that the Democrats being in charge is the main reason is just baffling to me. Again, this just ignores a lot of data to make its points. It just takes 3 random data points and makes a conclusion based on those and ignores literally everything else. Bear in mind, I'm not saying that the Democrats aren't or can't be at fault. What I'm saying is that the points made here don't actually show that at all.
And I promise you, if you made a list of the top 100 things that are devastating Black America today, systemic police brutality will not even make the list.
This is so patronizing. So many black people have come out to support Black Lives Matter. This clearly is high on the list for a lot of black people. Again, it just seems really odd for 2 non-black people to sit there and say, these are the problems facing Black America. Just ignore what a lot of Black America is saying, and these are what the problems actually are. It's just, why are you doing that? You know, it does seem odd for you to sit there and make out as though a lot of the people that are supporting Black Lives Matter are actually just misguided and should place their efforts elsewhere, especially when one of you works for a charity that thinks they're actually in opposition to Black Lives Matter. This is just really shady and really, really uncomfortable. Again, you're creating a false dichotomy. Supporting Black Lives Matter does not inhibit you from supporting other causes.
Just listen to whatever the media tells us to do.
Well, 100%.
We just wait. Oh,
That's why everyone's running around with
what
this.
should we be mad at, CNN?
Hold on.
That's why everyone's running around with
What
this.
should we...
Did she...
That's why everyone's running around with
What?
Did she really just...
That's why everyone's running around. What should we...
Okay, sure. Anyway, dismissing the experiences and concerns of black people as just doing what the media tells us is ludicrous. Granted, some people can be swept up into a media frenzy, but at the core of this movement, there are black people that are truly in support of the cause. Also, presenting the media as being solely biased towards the left is kind of disingenuous.
I used to be an editor for mainstream media companies, and I know what it means to create fake news.
You said it, not me.
And what most people don't know is that all of the major news networks that you watch, all of the media sites that you see online,
They're really owned by one. They're
owned by like 4 or 5 of the same corporations,
yeah. And they all have the same political views.
All of these corporations have very strong ties to the Democratic Party. So everything that we see online is specifically filtered, and it creates a specific narrative.
Yes.
Yeah, you know what? This is actually true. Although pretending that the media bias is solely left-leaning is just not really fair. Remember when a whole lot of news stations pushed an anti-fake news Trump speech?
But we are concerned about trouble and trending irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
So yeah, saying that the media bias is solely left-leaning is just not true, especially considering the fact that Fox News exists. I don't really know what this has got to do with Black Lives Matter though, because I've seen plenty of news stations that actually have shown a bias against Black Lives Matter protesters. Some places have shown the police in a better light and misrepresented protesters by cutting footage misleadingly, using misleading language, and omitting certain information. Like, there is a bias in some cases, but it's not always towards the left. You almost got me. You almost pulled me away from the real point. People aren't showing up to the Black Lives Matter protest because CNN told them to. They're showing up to the Black Lives Matter protest because they believe there is a problem in their country. And I promise you, the media is not the one that is fueling that. And you might say that the media is the one that is causing this frenzy, that is making it seem as though there's a problem, but the media doesn't need to be involved in this at all. So many of these stories are shared online without the help of the media, and that's when the media picks it up, because it's become such a big story online. That's the issue here. You're misrepresenting how this actually works. It's not the media saying, hey look, another black person was killed, everyone get mad. You're just disregarding black voices and presenting yourselves as seeing reality as it really is. Here's the thing though, and this is true for both left-wing people and right-wing people. When you're on the internet, it's very easy to fall down a rabbit hole or become radicalized. This point hits on some facts, but draws them out to conclusions that aren't really there. This is what you've been doing for so much of this video. You'll find something that is true. You'll find an actual fact, and you'll build an argument around that, but you'll obfuscate the truth. You'll omit certain things, and you won't give people the full information. So it seems like you're actually saying something that is on the whole true, but actually, you've really bastardized the truth to basically fit whatever the f you want it to. You haven't really given a reason at all for these media companies to push the Black Lives Matter or systemic oppression narrative. performative? What's in it for them? If they are so left-leaning and this is the thing that they're pushing, what are they gaining from it?
I see so many like direct ties that are exactly the same kind of mentality in regards to the LGBT community, specifically in regards to trans rights.
Here we go. Even in a video about Black Lives Matter, you still managed to weasel your awful little opinions about trans people in there, don't you, Arielle? I'm not even gonna waste my time on your views on trans rights and trans people. Plenty of other people have spoken about that before. I'll leave some links in the description.
One example is how many people died from
2009 people in 2019.
9 black people were killed by police.
No. 9 unarmed black people were killed by the police.
9 black people were killed by police, and I think 2 trans women the last few months.
Cite your sources, Arielle. Where is this coming from? I have no idea what data you're actually talking about. Are you talking about trans women being killed by police? Are you talking about trans women being murdered total? Are you talking about black trans women? You need to be clear about what you're talking about and make it clear where you're getting that data from. You said that 2 were killed in the past few months. I assume you're talking about the 2 trans women that were murdered in the space of about 2 days in June. I wonder why you use 2019 stats for a lot of things, but in this instance you only use the past few months. Could it be because 19 black trans women were murdered in 2019? I think it might be that.
And I think worldwide, 28 trans people, but we don't even know that they were actually killed for being trans, but just anytime somebody is killed,
and they're
that is a trans person, they assume that they were killed for being trans.
You know what, you're right. Unless it's reported as being a hate crime or it's motivated by that, it's very hard to tell whether someone was actually killed for being trans. Now, I'm not sure where you're getting your data from, cite your sources, but I can tell you that it's actually quite difficult to quantify the number of trans people that are murdered annually. That's partly due to the fact that the systems of classification that we've got aren't quite up to speed with trans people yet, but also because it's kind of difficult to get information on populations and murder. I actually found a really good study that spoke about these difficulties and tried to bring together a more accurate picture from using multiple different data sources. So this study actually found that trans people as a whole aren't necessarily more likely to be murdered, but trans women of color were. Again, this data was taken from multiple sources, some of them non-governmental sources, so I'm not going to sit here and state that as absolute fact. But what I will say is that the analysis of this data goes a slight step beyond Arielle's tactic of finding a number and deciding whether it seems high or not. The fact is that the data here isn't conclusive, but it does point to trans women of color potentially having a higher murder rate. Now that doesn't mean that they're being murdered for being trans women of color, but we do need to ask ourselves, why is the murder rate higher with this particular group? You can't just say you don't know for sure it's because they're trans, not provide any alternative reasoning, and then pretend like it doesn't matter. The current data points to there being some kind of correlation. This is something that needs to be studied more to get conclusive evidence, but it doesn't mean that we should just sweep it under the rug because we don't have anything concrete yet.
In reality, there are hundreds of thousands of females being mutilated every day and being raped every day just because they're female. Nobody cares.
No. There you go doing that false dichotomy thing again. People don't need to choose between supporting trans rights and opposing FGM, sexism, and rape. You are the person that is presenting these things as one or the other in an effort to get people to drop the one that you don't like. Funnily enough, I can support Black Lives Matter and trans rights, and also feminism, and any other cause that doesn't contradict with those beliefs. You are the ones saying that you need to make a choice. There are plenty of people out there that support all of these causes.
Just because they're female, nobody cares.
Yeah, nobody even talks about it.
So I guess the Me Too movement, you know, the one specifically to call out sexual abusers and just didn't happen. You know, I will concede that we could be talking more about FGM. It is criminalized here in the UK, but not in 12 states of America and a lot of other countries. If you check out the Orchid Project, link below, they're actually a charity that works to fight FGM. While we're on the topic of nobody talking about it, Arielle, I would like to point out that 8 of the 18 videos you've uploaded in the past 3 months at time of recording have had trans topics in the thumbnail or in the title of the video. Now that's not including the Black Lives Matter video you made, but if we add that in, that means 9 of the 18 videos, half of them in the past 3 months have had something to do with trans topics, Arielle. I don't think it's everyone else talking about trans stuff that's the problem. I think it's you talking about trans stuff that's the problem. If we look at the titles and thumbnails, none of them have hinted towards FGM or which makes it seem like you're not really talking about that. None have even mentioned sexism or feminism in the title or thumbnail unless trans topics were also mentioned. Granted, you could be bringing it up in the content of the video, but because it's such an important topic to you, I'd have expected you maybe make a dedicated video about it here or there. But granted, you might not want to talk about it on YouTube. That's fair enough. YouTube does reward you for sticking to strict genres of content, so I understand you not wanting to break outside of your brand of, you know, sex and shitting on trans people. So why don't we look at your Twitter instead? So I did a little search through your tweets. Here are all the ones that have the word trans in them. And here are all the ones that include FGM, female genital mutilation, or just genital mutilation. Oh no, I didn't actually forget to put them in. They're just not there. But here are the ones that say genital. Funnily enough, you'll notice that those are about trans people. And literally all of the tweets that you've made in 2020 that include the word rape have been about trans people. Between 2017 and 2020, you only made 2 tweets about the Me Too movement, and one of them was hardly in support of it. So here's my question, Arielle. If you don't think enough people are talking about FGM or rape, then why aren't you talking about it? Why do you jump on other movements and say, no one's talking about this, when you yourself are are not even talking about it. Before you start searching through my tweets, bear in mind I'm only bringing this up because you said that no one was talking about it. The reason I'm pointing this out is because you're being hypocritical. You don't support Black Lives Matter and you don't really support trans rights, and yet you're still not talking about FGM or all the other things that you said people should be talking about. Clearly, the issue here is not Black Lives Matter and trans rights distracting from these issues. You are clearly aware of them, but you don't seem to bring them up unless you want to use them as a retaliation. So you are too focused on trans to talk about the stuff that you claim to care about. You'll only mention it when it's in the context of trans people. You're kind of like MRAs that only bring up men's rights when they want to shout down feminists. If you're so focused on this and you care so much about it, then why do you never talk about these things when you're not already talking about trans people? There are so many factors that influence sexual violence, and you only seem to talk about the ones that relate to trans people. Or rather, the ones that pin trans people and their rights as the culprits, because you never really seem to talk about cases where trans people are actually the victim. Again, just to reiterate, supporting Black Lives Matter does not mean you can't support other causes. It's not one or the other.
This is why I think it's important to note that the outrage culture, not only does it not do anything for Black people, for Black communities, and for women who are suffering, but even worse than that, it actually takes us further and further away from actually helping Black communities thrive, from actually helping the women who are being raped every day, who are being mutilated around the world, and it actually takes away from these real issues that are plaguing these communities in real ways.
This outrage culture that you're talking about, you've not really explained what it is exactly. The outrage in regards to Black Lives Matter is not solely brought on via the media. It's not solely due to some fault in our culture that rewards outrage. This outrage is due to the systemic racism faced by Black people. And you know what? Outrage alone doesn't get you anywhere. I'll give you that. But this outrage is being directed into the form of protests, which does work, which does create change. It's outrage that is actually beneficial and actually has a purpose. Outrage alone, not a great thing, kind of useless, obviously. But outrage directed to make social change? That is something that is good, and that is something that is valuable. This reaction to the poor treatment of Black people can absolutely coexist with community-based programs to help Black people. Yet again, you're presenting these two things as a choice when that's just not the case. We need to dismantle these systemic issues, which is primarily done through protests and making changes in government. Providing community support is helpful and important, but alone it can't solve racism.
It's funny, right? Because it's a selfish thing, because people want something to be outraged about online and on camera, because it's like, it makes them look better. It like,
Of course.
because a virtue
Look how
signal, like,
non-racist I am.
yeah,
Look how
I'm a good person. I care. I run this big fitness business, but I actually care. I'm a good person. I run this big makeup brand, and I run this big, I'm a fashion designer, but I actually care.
See, now you're talking about performative activism. You're equating people's righteous outrage at the treatment of Black people to performative activism. Yes, outrage without any backing can be performative, but that's not what the Black Lives Matter movement is made up of. Again, we've seen people in Black Lives Matter actually call out performative activism. This isn't a problem that you've got with Black Lives Matter. You're just shafting them with the blame for a related issue.
The thing is, you're not doing anything to actually help these people.
Yeah, you know what? We agree on that, but where we disagree is that you see performative activism as being Black Lives Matter, despite the fact that Black Lives Matter has separated itself from performative activism. Black Lives Matter as a movement, as I've said, creates positive change through action.
Virtue signaling has become so strong in the LGBT community, similar to the Black community or people supporting the Black community.
You know, virtue signaling is something that some people and companies do, which is why we've got tokenism. But the way I see it, virtue signaling is a form of performative activism wherein the goal is to make oneself look good rather than create any positive change at all. Supporting Black Lives Matter isn't automatically virtue signaling. Some people and companies have come out and said Black Lives Matter without actually doing anything material behind it. And I'm sure a lot of people that support Black Lives Matter would agree that that is a bad thing. So we're kind of on the same page here, but just supporting Black Lives Matter alone is not virtue signaling. But shouting about supporting Black Lives Matter without actually doing anything to support it, yeah, you could call that virtue signaling.
We had a presidential candidate, I believe it was Elizabeth Warren.
I think it was, yeah.
That said, Black trans women are the backbone of this country. Yes, all three of them. Like literally, how many are there? I think I know 5, maybe.
It's nice of you to include the tweet, but what's odd is you've actually misquoted it, and also you've cropped out the tweet that it's replying to. What she actually said was, Black, trans, and cis women, gender non-conforming, and non-binary people are the backbone of our democracy. I shouldn't need to explain to you the difference between those two statements. It sounds like she's talking about groups that push for political change via protest. Marsha P. Johnson comes to mind. Whether it's actually virtue signaling or not is beyond the point. Most people know that politicians and companies used feigned interest in certain topics to gain more money or support. The issue I have here is not whether it's virtue signaling or not, it's the fact that you've misrepresented what she said so that you could make a joke about how few Black trans women there are. It's kind of lazy crazy, and to be honest, it's not even funny enough to bother keeping in, even if you ignore the fact that that's not what Elizabeth Warren said. Remember how I said that the tweet was cropped so that you couldn't see what it was replying to? This is why. Elizabeth Warren didn't just bring up black trans women out of nowhere, she was responding to a group that specifically is for black people that are non-binary, women, trans or cis, or gender non-conforming. And the reason for that is quite clear when you see that she's responding to an organisation for specifically that group of people. And that organisation had endorsed her. So she's not bringing it up out of nowhere just to virtue signal, she's simply thanking an organisation that has endorsed her. That's quite obvious.
To virtue signal to that degree and completely ignore more real issues.
More real
more
issues.
People.
Yeah.
Even ignoring the fact that you've tried to misrepresent the truth again, Arielle, it doesn't even make sense to say that this is evidence of Warren not talking about other issues. She's a senator, so obviously she does a lot more than just tweet, but here are some of her tweets about the issues that you've spoken about. Granted, she's not spoken about FGM, but then to be fair, neither of you or Gina at the time of recording.
And this is a good parallel between the two. They take a small number, like the number of trans women who've been killed in the last year or something, like, you know, whatever the small number is, and then you also take in 2019, 9 black people who were killed by cops. They take these statistics and they somehow make them out to be a systemic issue.
Well, yeah, looking at those numbers in relation to other numbers, that's how statistics works. This somehow you're talking about is quite literally statistics. It's taking rates of murder, suicide, and violence and combining them with stats from other things like education and poverty, etc., and then seeing what picture that presents. That's literally what is happening. It looks like black trans women are murdered at higher rates. Now that points to some kind of racism, misogyny, or transphobia being the culprit. Alone, those small numbers don't mean much, but that applies to any stat that you quote in a vacuum. These small numbers need context to be relevant. I've already shown that with the seemingly small number of unarmed black people that are murdered by police, that actually translates to a rate 2.8 times higher than that of white people. What you're doing is completely ignoring how stats actually work and reducing them to standalone numbers.
You can't really say that trans women are being killed on a systemic level. You can't just inflate that all of a sudden and then just say that black people are being gunned down and it's a systemic police brutality. The numbers don't point to that.
Yes, they do. Either you don't understand that or you're deliberately ignoring it to make your point.
And this is why we need to be able to separate emotion from logic.
Here's a big one. Showing emotion doesn't mean your argument is inherently illogical, and just because someone appears emotionless and detached, that doesn't mean that their argument is any more logical. This is just a really easy thing to levy at people that are debating about topics that actually affect them, and it's usually done by people that aren't really affected by the topics of debate. Black people being angry at the way that we're treated does not make our thoughts and feelings any less logical, especially when that anger is because of systemic racism and the data that backs it up. Again, showing emotion does not indicate an illogical or irrational stance. We are all influenced by bias, and just because you can appear calm and emotional, it doesn't mean that your argument isn't being influenced by your biases. This is something that's used to silence black people, specifically black women. You know the stereotype of the loud, crazy black woman? Yeah, this is that in action. It's using the way that someone makes their points to completely discredit those points, rather than discrediting the points themselves. It's far easier to seem emotionless and calm when you're talking about an issue that doesn't directly affect you, and honestly, it's insulting for the two of you to sit there, neither of you black, and tell black people what is good for them, and go on to say that they shouldn't show any emotion in response to systemic racism. I'll say it once more for good luck. Showing emotion does not mean that your argument is based on emotion, and it also doesn't mean that your argument is any more illogical.
Be able to separate emotion from logic. Yes, we should care. Yes, we should have compassion for people who are killed unjustly, but that doesn't mean that you should let your emotions just run wild to the point where you don't have any more common sense, to the point where you don't listen to facts and objective truth. Statistics actually matter.
I hope my video has shown that you're actually ignoring facts and objective truth. Statistics do matter, which is why it's important that you represent them correctly, and you haven't. On top of that, anger is an appropriate emotional response to oppression. Telling the oppressed that they should remain calm and civil when rallying against oppressors is an idea made up to keep people oppressed. So long as that anger is being channeled into appropriate action, it makes complete sense and it's actually useful. These emotions that people have in response to these issues are not in spite of logic. They're logical reactions to the facts that they're presented with.
And we've gotten to the point now where if you even talk about these statistics, and if you even have the guts to say, well, hey, trans women being killed is not a systemic issue. Hey, black people being killed by cops is not a systemic issue. You're called transphobic and you're called racist.
Yeah.
But you're misrepresenting the statistics though. I will agree with you that the numbers might not actually be there to support the idea that trans people being murdered is a systemic issue. But the numbers are kind of there to support that trans women of color being murdered is a systemic issue. You're not talking about the facts, Arielle. You're misrepresenting them. And if you're misrepresenting the facts that point towards systemic racism or oppression, then I think it's absolutely fair to call that racist. Because what you're doing is upholding a racist system. It's not because you're stating facts, because that's not what you're doing. You're picking up random data points and saying that they point to the thing thing that you want them to point to. You're not actually looking at studies, you're not citing sources, you're just pulling out data points and making up a story around them.
Here's the thing about the left is that it's in direct opposition to objective reality.
What a ridiculous statement. I've already pointed out why branding the left as just one monolithic group isn't really the best thing to do. But also, this statement just falls apart as soon as you actually look at the statistics properly. It's a little bit funny that someone who works so closely with Trump supporters talks about opposition to objective reality being exclusive to the left. Yes, there are people on the left who ignore facts or nuance in order to further their point. But you have that on both sides. This opposition to objective reality thing, by the way, it's a phrase that TERFs use quite a lot to validate their own invalidation of trans people.
So for example, this intersectional ideology, right? Transgenderism, as it's defined today, there's no such thing as a man or a woman. Transgenderism and feminism literally cannot coexist.
Flashback.
I'm not even gonna waste my time on your views on trans rights and trans people. Plenty of other people have spoken about that before.
End of flashback.
I'm gonna waste my time on your bullshit trans opinions. I genuinely don't know where to start with this one, but transgenderism today does not get rid of the idea of man or woman. If anything, that's more a really gross oversimplification of gender abolitionism. But even then, transgenderism today does not dictate that one needs to be a gender abolitionist. There are plenty of places that will describe this more in depth for you, but very basically put, transgenderism today does not want the dissolution of the terms man or woman. They are just no longer terms that necessarily refer to one's sex. They refer to gender. It's literally that simple. You could be a cis woman or a trans woman, but woman is still something that exists. Non-binary people exist outside of the traditional gender binary. That doesn't mean that man and woman don't exist, it means they just don't apply to them. The categorizations of male and female still exist as much as they ever have, it just means that now they don't necessarily apply to gender. That's the thing, in a sentence, transgenderism today is the idea that sex and gender do not necessarily have to align with one another. As for transgenderism and feminism not being able to coexist, you're absolutely right if you adopt second wave or radical feminism, which is kind of outdated now. Intersectionality became much more of a focus in third and fourth wave feminism, which is kind of the more modern feminist movement. So transgenderism and feminism can absolutely coexist unless you're stuck in the past. Intersectionality, by the way, it's used here to sound like a bad thing, but all it really means is just recognizing that all the different sort of social groups and categories that a person falls under can combine to influence their experience. It's literally that simple. It's the fact that a black bisexual woman doesn't experience being black, bisexual, and a woman separately, that she experiences all of those things together, that they influence each other and interact in ways that create a different experience. That's literally all it means. Intersectionality is the difference between saying women got the vote when one particular subset of women got the vote and saying women got the vote when all women of voting age were legally allowed to vote. That's basically the difference there. It's the idea that feminism, anti-racism, and LGBTQ+ activism should include all members of those groups. So feminism that focuses solely on white women over the age of 30 isn't really very good feminism because it doesn't include black women, or women under the age of 30, or any number of other groups of women. That's the point, that you should include all women in your feminism.
And I think people are making it out to seem like Black America and white America can't coexist.
Maybe, but that would be the incredible minority of people. People are not saying that Black America can't coexist with white America. They're saying that Black America can't coexist with a racist America. Those are not the same thing. People see Black Lives Matter as an attack on white people and see activists rallying against things that are racist and see that as an attack on whiteness. That's because of systemic racism. Tearing down the statue of a slave trader is not an attack on whiteness or white history. It's an attack on the incredibly racist institution of slavery. Almost no one believes that Black America and white America can't coexist. But white America needs to help solve the problem of racism. Black people cannot exist in a racist system that oppresses them. And again, anti-racism is not anti-white. But being apolitical or neutral on this issue is upholding the status quo. And because the status quo is racist, if you do nothing about it, then you're upholding a racist system.
Which is ridiculous.
This narrative is ridiculous to me.
Yeah, because you've misrepresented the views of a majority of people in order to make it seem ridiculous. Most people would agree that the narrative that Black America and white America can't coexist is ridiculous. But luckily, that's not something that Black Lives Matter supporters actually believe.
If you walk around the streets, literally, nobody gives a
Nobody gives a Nobody gives a
It's been months, and there are still protests going on. How can you say that you go outside and no one seems to care, when you know that people are still protesting? Do you expect every single time you go outside to see people shouting and screaming about it? No, people still need to get on with their lives, but the fact that some people are protesting still means that people do care about it. I care about this issue. I've gone to protest, but I still need to go to the shops to get food, and when I'm doing that, I'm not shouting and screaming about it, am I? No, some people will be quiet about it sometimes and loud about it other times. Just because every single time you go outside, you haven't seen people shouting and raving about it all the time, does not mean that people don't care.
And see, what's so funny to me is that I grew up in South Georgia, super black, right outside Savannah, Georgia. Savannah,
I think it's actually the most black.
Savannah is 54% black
that's
people.
where my friend lives.
My very first school teacher in kindergarten, she was a black woman. I grew up around a lot of black people, and
Bingo! This bit filled out my I'm not a racist bingo card. There is on screen. Thank you very much for playing. Okay, here we go. None of these things mean that you can't uphold racist ideals or be racist yourself. Growing up around black people doesn't mean that you understand the black experience, and growing up around black people also doesn't mean that you can discredit the huge number of black voices that absolutely disagree with you.
it was just half and half. And anyone sort of like in between, especially when I was growing up, like being Asian or Indian or anything was sort of seen as weird, but black or white, it was just normal.
Right.
I mean, I can count on not even one hand the times that I've seen racism in the Deep South growing up. And we're talking about in the 90s and the early 2000s. Like, this is the time where we were told, like, this is where all the racism is in the South, in the Bible Belt. Like, I experienced a little bit of racism myself, but I think that was because we were, like, different.
I have had people refuse to allow me to use a self-service checkout by myself, despite the fact that all the white people around me were allowed to do that. I've had people kick me out of a shopping centre for literally doing nothing wrong. I've been told that I sound much more well-spoken than I look, despite the fact that this person knew my background, and given my background, the way I speak is perfectly normal. I've been stopped and checked going into a tube station while the white person I was with was not stopped at all. I've had people be racist towards me in school and use racist insults. I've had friends use racist insults, and not all of those were the N-word. The fact is that racism exists in a lot of ways, and some of those ways are sometimes difficult for an outside observer to see. Racism is not always people shouting abuse in the streets. It is not always immediately obvious. Gina said that she experienced racism, so I don't understand why she's trying to push this narrative.
The left is trying to convince you that in the broader sense that America is bad, and then they want to convince you that America is systemically racist.
Nice, good job. Appeal to American patriotism to get your point across. The left doesn't want to convince you that America is bad and just be done with it. The goal of showing the problems in America is not to say, oh boy, what a bad country we live in, better get rid of it. No, the point is to fix those problems. Obviously. Pretending that America doesn't have a problem with race doesn't make it a better country. Fixing that problem does. Left-leaning people don't necessarily hate America. Plenty of them love America and want to see it be better. Some of them do hate it though, and you know what? They've got perfectly valid reasons for that. None of this discredits any of their arguments. Pretending that your country is the best to appeal to patriotism and jingoistic values does not make your country any better. It just ignores the problems and silences the people speaking up about them.
I just saw somebody tweet the other day, this black guy, he's like, the media keeps trying to tell me that everyone is racist, but I have yet to experience racism myself.
You seeing one tweet from one black guy hardly discredits all of the black people that have spoken about systemic racism. But nice try though. Privilege doesn't mean that you automatically win, and oppression doesn't mean that you automatically lose. The fact is that privilege is an advantage and oppression is a disadvantage. You can still win with a disadvantage, but it's a lot harder, and that's the point. It's a lot harder for black people to win with the disadvantage of systemic racism. No one is saying that a black person can never win, but the fact is, a lot of the times if a black person wants to win, they've got to jump through a lot more hoops than a white person would. Just because this one guy hasn't had the N-word shouted at him doesn't mean that America isn't racist. You know, I've never actually had that shouted at me in the street. In fact, I've not had faggot shouted at me in the street. Does that mean that the world isn't homophobic?
Another example of how Black Lives Matter or the Black Lives Matter movement is similar to, you know, the LGBT crazy activist movement is they will prop up a martyr. You know, somebody that like died for the cause. Like now we can
make him a hero.
Like make them a hero.
You have really misunderstood the Black Lives Matter movement if you think that George Floyd, Bailey Mujinga, and Breonna Taylor died for the cause. They're not propped up as martyrs. They're propped up as victims of an unjust system. They are not heroes in the sense that they fought and died for what they believe in. Now, some people might call them heroes, but I personally disagree with that. And I think that the majority of people behind the Black Lives Matter movement would disagree that they are heroes in the sense that they fought and died, because that's the entire point. They didn't fight and die. They just died and didn't get justice. That's why they're propped up. They're not propped up as martyrs, people that died for what they believe in. They're propped up as victims, people who died for no reason and were not given the justice that they deserve. This movement is about demanding justice for their needless murders that would have otherwise gone ignored. That's the point. They're not martyrs. They didn't die for what they believed in. They just died and got nothing from it. That's the entire fucking point, Arielle. You should really understand that. The fact that you can sit there and say that these people are being held up as martyrs is disgusting. They are not being held up as martyrs. You know that. The names aren't being repeated because they died for what they believed in. Their names are being repeated because they died for no reason other than being black.
Another parallel between the two that's funny is that if you see someone, for example, in the black community speak out against Black Lives Matter, like Candace or Brandon, then all of a sudden they lose their black card.
They lose their black card. You're not a real black person.
You're not a real
like
black
Joe
person.
Biden, what did he say?
He
if you
said,
don't vote for me, you're not black.
No, but he said, you ain't black.
You ain't black. So he was trying to speak the language.
Look, I can absolutely understand the black community not wanting to stand up and support someone that actively works against the interests of black people. But I think this revoking the black card thing is just utter nonsense. As in, I think it's a really silly thing for people to say. I don't think people should really be saying it. And that's a really weird and inappropriate comment for Biden to make. A lot of people on the left will agree with you, and in fact, a lot of people within Black Lives Matter will also agree with you on that one. And to be honest, this is probably the only decent point that you've actually made. People shouldn't be saying it. It's pretty simple.
Another parallel is, black conservatives are people that aren't going along with the hive mind narrative that the left is spewing.
This one is just utter Calling a group of people that agree on things a hive mind is just an easy way to get people to join your group of people that agree on things. I guess this comes from people calling each other out for racism or transphobia, but realistically, if your group is against racism and transphobia, you shouldn't really allow people in your group to harbour racist or transphobic views. Of course you want to talk people out of bigotry and hold them accountable. You want the people in your movement to be growing as people. This is something that I've heard about American Republicans. Now, I wouldn't take this as 100% fact because I don't think I know America's system well enough to make this judgment, but I have heard it from other people who I think do know well enough. Basically, the idea is that you seem to see more infighting amongst Democrats. You see them calling each other out for things or holding people accountable, whereas with the Republicans, they're more of a monolithic group that just kind of defend each other for basically everything. You won't often see a Republican calling out another Republican for something that they've done. Again, I can't say this is absolute fact because I feel we need to be really, really tuned into the American political sphere to make this kind of statement.
Said that they have internalized racism.
Internalized misogyny or racism, right.
Internalized misogyny. Or, Arielle, you don't agree with what, what Hillary is saying or what this left person is saying, and it's like, you must be internalized homophobia. You must have internalized homophobia. Blair, Blair must be internalizing transphobia.
Oh, another one, they say you hate yourself. There's a lot of self-hatred there.
You hate yourself because these people hate you.
Now, I'm not saying that everyone that says this is in the right, absolutely not, but this idea comes from the fact that black people can still be racist, LGBT people can still be homophobic, and trans people can still be transphobic. Just because you're a member of a group doesn't mean that you can't hold prejudice towards that group, and that's what internalized prejudice is. And it's very easy to have that kind of internalized prejudice when you live in a world that kind of gears you towards prejudice against certain groups. Internalized prejudice doesn't necessarily mean that you hate yourself, but it does often mean that you'll act against the best interests of that group that you're a part of. It can also manifest in validating yourself against your eternal prejudice by saying you're not like one of the others. This is where the whole sort of not like other girls things comes from. That's where girls will step on femininity and other women in order to hold themselves up as higher than that. In that sense, you have internalized sexism, but you're not applying it to yourself because you're not like the others. But the others still deserve sexism. Another decent example of this is some trans people who feel insecure in themselves and so punch down at other trans people in order to make themselves feel better. I don't think that means that people should be telling other people that they hate themselves, but I also don't think that undermines the idea of internalized prejudice as being a motivator for some people.
I do think there are good people protesting for BLM who are in support of trans people. I think they have good hearts and they really do want to help. If you're watching this and if you're one of those people, well, actually do something about it. Then join these organizations and join the people who are actually on the ground really helping these communities, because I promise you, posting a black box on your Instagram or posting some picture of yourself at a pride parade, like, that's not going to do anything for these communities.
I agree, and so do Black Lives Matter activists, that posting a black square is not helpful to anyone. But equating Black Lives Matter protests to presumably white people doing armchair performative activism is just not it. I've already said that people in the Black Lives Matter movement were speaking out about Blackout Tuesday being performative and unhelpful. And nowadays, pride parades are more celebrations than they are protests. Right now, you're not speaking to Black Lives Matter activists or LGBT+ activists. What you're doing is speaking to people that are performative and want to appear like they're part of those movements. In that sense, Black Lives Matter and LGBT+ activists would absolutely agree with you. And it's so sneaky of you to paint both of these groups as people that will just post black squares or pride pictures. I want to close with this. Arielle, I'm not mad that you made a video about Black Lives Matter without a black person. I take issue with the fact that you've misrepresented the facts, disregarded the voices of black people, and couldn't even get a black person on to do it. This is not a conversation that white or non-black people need to be excluded from. But when the overwhelming majority of black people disagree with you, and the data disagrees with you, why do you feel the need to stand against them? Usually what you seem to do is find people from communities that have sort of fringe views and then bring them on to sign off on your hateful content. You did it with Ryan, and you did it with Calvin, and I really have to wonder why you just couldn't do it with this one. I want you to know that when people tell you to talk less and listen more on this topic, that's not them being racist towards you. People aren't asking you just to keep quiet because you're white. People are asking you not to speak over others that know this topic better than you. People are asking you not to disregard the voices of black people. People are asking you not to be a countercultural mouthpiece for a topic with which you have no first-hand experience and very little understanding of the data. You don't understand the race problem in America today. Yes, racial prejudice can apply to any and all races from any and all races. The racism that black people face today is not just situational. It's institutional. It's omnipresent in society. The fact is that you being told not to speak up on a topic that you know very little about is not comparable to the systemic racism that black people are facing. Here's the thing. If you don't believe in systemic racism, then I can absolutely understand why you see both of those scenarios as basically the same, and why you think this whole situation is being overblown. And to be honest, I can understand why you would not want to believe in systemic racism despite the fact that so many black, brown, and non-white people have said that it exists in the way that it does. Unless you're being oppressed by it, it's easy to overlook. As a white person, you can ignore it for your entire life if someone doesn't make you aware of it. But when you're made aware of it, you can then either join the fight or just pretend that it doesn't exist. The reason people will call out this video for not having a black person in it is not because only black people can talk about these issues. It's the fact that if you're going to go against the grain and actually disregard the voices of so many black people, it would make sense to have a black person on that can corroborate and share their experiences. But you couldn't seem to do that. As I've said, this isn't a conversation just for black people. We need everyone's help to fix this. But you're using your voice to tear down Black Lives Matter, which makes it seem like you don't really care very much at all. Especially when the only alternative that you bring up has a very clear ulterior motive of making black people exit the left. That sullies the message. It makes it seem like you don't really care about black people, you're just doing this to further your own agenda of people moving towards the right. It seems like you'll only support an organization that actually helps black communities if it also furthers your own political message. You can support Blexit, that's your business, but as I've already said, Black Lives Matter's goals and Blexit's community-focused programs can absolutely coexist. You didn't need to make this video tearing down Black Lives Matter to build up Blexit. Blexit should be able to stand in its own right. You didn't need to use this as an opportunity to attack trans rights, but you did. You didn't need to use this as an opportunity to attack Black Lives Matter, but you did. On top of that, to bolster your argument against Black Lives Matter, you twisted and misrepresented data and facts. Now, I don't know if you did that deliberately or accidentally, but that is what you did. Whether intentional or not, Arielle, this video is spreading misinformation and feeding your own self-interest. It's not for the good of black people. That was a big video, wasn't it? Thank you for sitting through it. Here are some charities that you can donate to if you want. There's the Orchid Project for FGM, which I've already mentioned. There's some American trans charities. And then one that's quite close to my heart, there's Mermaids. So you can donate to that. That's a trans charity in the UK for trans youth. You can also, if you'd like, I've got these hats. If you buy the trans or non-binary designs, half of the profits of that will also go to Mermaids. So if you want to get something out of it, you can go get those if you want. But if you want to just donate, links are in the description. Feels really weird asking you to like and subscribe on this kind of video, but if you've made it to this point, you probably should. It would really help me out and it'll make me really happy. So do that, please. You can also check out my podcast. We've got new episodes every week and new live shows every 2 weeks. You might like the Trans Brains episodes if you enjoyed this video. You can check out my Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all that stuff. I'm notcorry everywhere, and I don't have anything left to say to you.